The day John Abbott buried his wife and infant son in the same grave, he made a silent promise to the red Wyoming earth that he would never again allow anything soft to take root inside him. That was 3 years before Fannie Graves rode into Clearwater Bend on a June afternoon in 1878, seated in the back of Walt Pruitt's supply wagon with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, a cast iron skillet strapped to the outside of her largest case, and an expression on her face that suggested she had already argued with the entire world and was prepared to argue with it again. John Abbott did not see her arrive. He was on the far edge of his property, mending the fence along the north pasture, driving iron staples into weathered cedar posts with a methodical fury that had become his substitute for conversation, for prayer, for most things that required feeling. His ranch sat on the west bank of Clearwater Creek, a property of 340 acres he had built from stripped ground up, every beam and board placed by his own 2 hands or the hands of men he had paid fairly and never once befriended. The cabin was solid. The barn was solid. The fences were going back to solid after last winter's ice storms had buckled 3 sections. John Abbott was a man who believed in solid things. The cabin on the east bank of the creek had been empty for 2 full seasons, ever since old Hector Baines had died in his sleep the previous autumn and his nephew down in Cheyenne had neither the interest nor the energy to come claim it. The land sat there, 20 acres, a good well, a serviceable 1-room cabin with a stone fireplace and a sleeping loft, and a small hay shed that leaned only slightly to the left. John had considered buying it, mainly because having a neighbor felt like an intrusion on the particular quality of quiet he had cultivated. He had never gotten around to making the inquiry. Now apparently someone else had moved faster than he had. He found out about his new neighbor from Pruitt himself, who stopped his empty wagon on the road back past John's gate and hollered until John walked over. "Got a new resident settled in across the way," Walt said, pushing his hat back on his head. He was a round, cheerful man who had been delivering goods to the Clearwater Bend area since before John had arrived. "Young woman, name of Graves, Fannie Graves. She came up from Laramie, bought that Baines property through the land office, paid cash money for it." John looked across the creek. He could see a figure moving between the cabin and the hay shed, carrying something. He looked away. "That's so," he said. "Traveling alone," Walt added, with the particular tone of a man who considers information to be a gift and expects some gratitude for the giving of it. "Said she was a schoolteacher down in Laramie, but the school board there had some disagreement with her about the curriculum. She did not elaborate and I did not press, but she had the look of a woman who had done the pressing herself on the matter of principle. She got someone coming to help her get settled. Did not mention anyone. Just had her things and that skillet." Walt paused. "You might want to stop over and introduce yourself, being neighborly." "She bought 20 acres in the Wyoming territory by herself," John said. "She probably does not need my introduction to manage the remainder of her day." Walt looked at him for a moment. "John," he said, not unkindly, "you know I liked Clara, everybody liked Clara, but it has been 3 years." John went back to his fence. Walt drove on. The first time John Abbott actually saw Fannie Graves up close was 4 days after she moved in, and it was because she was standing in the middle of his side of the creek. He had come down to the water in the early morning to check the small diversion channel. He used to water the garden plot behind his cabin. The creek ran clear and cold even in summer, no more than knee-deep in most places in June, and the crossing was easy on horseback or on foot. She was standing in the shallows on his side with her skirts tucked up into her belt, which exposed her stockinged calves in a manner that was entirely practical given the situation, but which still made him stop walking abruptly enough that a stone rolled under his boot. She was examining something along the bank, crouching slightly, her dark hair pinned up under a straw hat, a notebook open in her left hand. She was writing in it. "Morning," she said, without looking up. She had heard him despite not appearing to. "This is my side of the bank," he said. She did look up then. She had dark brown eyes and a direct gaze, the kind that did not flicker or apologize, and she appeared to be perhaps 26 or 27 years old. Not a girl, but a woman who had lived enough of life to have opinions about it. "I am documenting the plant species along the creek bank," she said. "Educational purposes, I intend to start a school. There is already a school in Clearwater Bend. I know, I have seen it. It has 32 children crammed into a space meant for 20, one teacher doing the work of 3, and no books younger than 1859. She closed the notebook, stood, and extended her hand across the modest distance between them with a composure that clearly expected to be met. "Fannie Graves, I bought the Baines property." He shook her hand because there was no polite alternative. Her grip was firm and businesslike. "John Abbott, that is my fence line up there." "I know. I asked Walt Pruitt about the neighboring properties before I purchased mine. I like to understand the landscape before I commit to living in it." She tilted her head slightly. "You built that fence yourself, most of it. It is good work." She said it without flattery, as one states a simple fact, and then she stepped back into the creek and waded to her own bank and went back to her cabin without any further ceremony. John stood at the edge of the water and looked after her for a moment longer than was necessary. He went back to his work. Over the following 2 weeks, he became aware of her the way you become aware of a sound you cannot immediately identify, a persistent note at the edge of your attention that you keep trying to assign to something familiar and cannot. She was active. That was the first thing he noticed. She was up before light most mornings, her window showing a small amber glow before the sky had gone from black to gray. She was working on the cabin. He could hear it sometimes when the wind came from the east, the sound of a hammer, the scrape of something being dragged, the particular high note of a saw cutting through wood. One morning he saw her on the roof. She was replacing shingles on the east face, moving with careful deliberateness, a canvas apron over her dress, a bucket of nails beside her. He watched from across the creek for approximately 30 seconds before he understood 2 things simultaneously. She was doing it correctly and methodically, and there was a section of the ridge board near the chimney that, from his angle, looked compromised in a way she could not see from where she was working. He crossed the creek. She heard him coming and looked down from the roof with neither surprise nor distress. "Mr. Abbott, there is a bad section near your chimney. Second board from the east. Looks like the wood has gone soft underneath. You will want to brace it before you put weight on it." She turned and looked at the section he indicated. She did not argue, which he had half expected. Instead, she moved very carefully to examine it, pressing with her hand, and made a low sound of acknowledgement. "You are right. I had not gotten that far yet." She sat back on her haunches. "Do you have a spare piece of ridge board? In the barn, I can bring it over. I will pay you for it. It is leftover material. It is just sitting there. I will still pay you for it. I am not starting out in debt to my neighbor." He looked up at her on the roof for a moment. "No," he said, "I expect you are not." He brought the board, and he stayed long enough to help set it properly because it was genuinely easier with 2 people, and there was no useful reason to pretend otherwise. They worked in the kind of silence that people arrive at when they are both competent at a task and do not need to narrate it. When it was done, she climbed down and paid him 20 cents for the material, which was a fair price, and thanked him without excessive warmth and without coldness either. He walked back to his side of the creek and did not look back at her cabin. But that night he sat on his porch in the cooling evening air and found himself wondering what had brought a woman alone to 20 acres in Wyoming when she could presumably be somewhere considerably more comfortable. He had not thought about another person's circumstances in a long time. He pushed the wondering away and went inside. July came in with heat and the smell of dry grass, and with it came the day Fannie Graves knocked on his door. He opened it to find her holding a covered plate and wearing an expression that he was beginning to recognize as her default one, which was the expression of a person who has already anticipated your objection and prepared her response to it. "I made too much rabbit stew," she said. "I would rather it went somewhere useful than be wasted. I'm not establishing a pattern of feeding you, and I am not asking you to eat with me. I simply had extra." He looked at the plate. He had not had rabbit stew since Clara had made it, and the recollection arrived unexpectedly and lodged briefly in his chest before he could stop it. "Thank you," he said, and took the plate. She turned and walked back toward the creek. He ate the stew standing at his kitchen table, and it was very good, the rabbit tender and the gravy thick with wild onion. And he stood there longer than he needed to after he finished, with the empty plate in his hands, thinking about nothing in particular in the specific way that means you are thinking about something quite particular indeed. He returned the plate the next day with a small sack of flour. He set it on her porch step, knocked once, and left before she came to the door. He did not examine why he had done it that way. The weeks moved on. August arrived. The heat was serious now, the kind that pressed down on the land all day and only released in the late evenings when the wind came off the mountains. John rode the fence lines. He worked his cattle. He traded at Walt Prute's store every 2 weeks for what he needed, and otherwise kept to his own company. He had always been good at keeping to his own company. But the east bank of the creek was no longer empty, and he was aware of it in a way that the empty bank had never demanded awareness. He began to know her rhythms without intending to. He knew she rose early. He knew she kept a garden, a serious one, larger than you would expect for one person, and he suspected she was selling or trading some of what it produced. He knew she drove Walt Prute's secondary wagon into town twice a week and came back with books and paper and chalk. He had heard from Walt that she had indeed started a school, using the church hall on days the pastor did not need it, and that she had 12 students already and the capacity for more if she could secure a proper building. He did not think about her, particularly. He simply knew these things the way you know the behavior of weather, as patterns that exist in your daily reality without requiring your emotional investment. That was what he told himself. The night he admitted the truth of the matter, even to himself alone, was the night in late August when she came running across the creek in the dark. He had been asleep. The knock was hard, urgent, not the polite knock of a social call. He was at the door with his rifle before his boots were fully on, and he opened it to find Fannie Graves on his porch, a lantern in her hand, her hair down and her expression doing something he had not seen it do before, which was genuine alarm underneath the fierce composure. "There is something in my hay shed," she said. "Something large. It has frightened my horses badly. I think it may be a mountain lion." He was already reaching for his coat. "Show me." They crossed the creek together in the dark, the lantern throwing a small warm circle around them. He could hear the horses from 20 yards away, the low, desperate sound of animals caught between confinement and terror. He had her hold the lantern back and approached the shed himself, stepping slowly, listening. There was something in there. He could hear it moving, heavy, irregular. He unbarred the shed door and opened it in one motion, standing to the side. What came out was not a mountain lion. It was a yearling black bear, scraggly and confused and apparently as frightened as the horses had been, and it burst out of the open door and crashed through the underbrush behind the shed at a speed remarkable for its size and was gone into the darkness within seconds. He lowered the rifle. He stood there in the aftermath of the racket, and then he heard, behind him, Fannie Graves let out a breath that was half relief and half a laugh she was trying not to release. "A bear," she said. "Yearling. Probably separated from its mother, looking for food." The laugh came out then, genuine and unguarded, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh, and he found that it was a very good sound. She had both hands pressed over her mouth and her shoulders were shaking. "I told 2 of my students last week that a person should remain calm in the presence of wildlife," she said. "I was considerably less calm than I recommended. You knocked on my door. That is reasonably calm. I practically ran across a creek in the dark carrying a lantern. Also reasonable. Mountain lions are a different matter than yearling bears." She had composed herself by then, though there was still a brightness in her eyes that the lantern caught. She looked at him in the near darkness with the same direct gaze she always employed and said, "Thank you for coming so quickly. I did not have much doubt that you would, but I want to say thank you anyway." He looked at her for a moment. "You are welcome," he said, and he meant it in a way that felt heavier than the words required. He calmed her horses before he left, moving slowly among them and speaking low until their breathing steadied. She watched him from the shed doorway and did not speak while he did it, which was something he appreciated, because some people filled quiet with words out of discomfort, and she clearly did not have that particular failing. Walking back across the creek alone, he understood that the arrangement he had constructed in his mind, wherein Fannie Graves was simply a neighbor who existed at a comfortable empirical distance, was not quite holding the shape he had intended for it. September brought the early hints of cold to the mountain air, and with them, a development that complicated things considerably, which was that Fannie Graves's water pump broke. She came to tell him about it on a Wednesday morning with the practical directness she brought to all problems. "The pump mechanism has cracked through. I cannot repair it myself, and the part needs to come from Cheyenne. Walt says 2 weeks at least. I will need to use the creek directly until then, which is manageable, but I wanted to ask if I could also use your well for washing if the occasion requires. I will of course compensate you for the use." "You do not need to compensate me for the use of water," he said. "I prefer to operate on equitable terms with my neighbors. Then you can help me clear the irrigation ditch on the south end next week. It has been filling with silt and I have been putting it off." She considered this with the brief deliberateness she gave to all transactions. "That is fair," she said. So she came to his well twice during those 2 weeks, and he found himself aware of her presence on his property in the way that you are aware of sunlight when it moves through a room, not disruptive, not unwanted, simply present and changing the quality of things. The day they cleared the irrigation ditch was a day that shifted something. It was a clear September day, cold in the morning and warm by noon, the kind of Wyoming day that reminded you briefly and specifically of what made the place beautiful before it went back to making you work for everything. They worked side by side along the ditch, shoveling out the accumulated silt, and somewhere around the second hour she started talking. She talked about the school, about the children, about a boy named Eli Crane who was 10 years old and had never held a book before she gave him one, and who now came in 2 hours before the other students to read everything she would let him borrow. She talked about the curriculum dispute in Laramie, which had involved her insistence on teaching both the girls and the boys mathematics at the same level, and the school board's equally firm insistence that this was unnecessary for the girls and possibly dangerous to the social order. She talked about these things without indignation, simply as facts, but with an underlying steel that made clear she had considered the injustice and filed it carefully, and intended to work around it on her own terms in her own space. He listened. He had not realized how long it had been since he had listened to anyone talk at length until she was doing it, and he found that he was not just politely enduring it. He was actually listening. He asked a question about Eli Crane, something about whether the boy had family in the area, and she answered him and asked him something back, and then they were simply talking the way two people talk when they are actually interested in each other's answers. He told her something about the ranch, about why he had come to Wyoming specifically, about the land survey he had done himself because he could not afford to hire it done, and had learned to use surveying equipment from a book and a great deal of error. She found this interesting and asked about the error part, which he had not expected, because most people wanted the eventual correct part. "The errors are the interesting part," she said, shoveling a load of silt onto the bank. "That is where the actual learning happens." He thought about this. "That is probably true. It is definitely true. I have never learned anything useful from doing something correctly on the first attempt." They finished the ditch by mid-afternoon, and she stayed for the cup of coffee he offered, sitting at his kitchen table with her muddy boots on and looking around his cabin with the open assessment of a person who reads rooms the way some people read text. "This is very orderly," she said. It was not a criticism or a compliment, just an observation. I find it easier to think when things are orderly." Clara kept it this way. She said it plainly, not cautiously, not the way most people in the territory handled the subject of Clara, which was to approach it as if it were something explosive buried at uncertain depth. He looked at her. "No, Clara was not particularly orderly. The orderliness is mine." He paused. "You know about Clara. Walt told me some. I did not pry, but I wanted you to know that I am not unaware of it in case it was something you thought you had to manage around me." She looked at him steadily. "I am sorry for what you lost, both of them." He was quiet for a moment. The cabin held the particular afternoon light that slanted through the west window, the same light that had been slanting through that window for 3 years while he had sat in this room alone. "Thank you," he said. "It came out differently than usual, heavier and lighter at the same time." "You do not have to say anything else about it," she said. "I just wanted to say that." They drank their coffee and talked about other things, and when she left she said she would bring him a copy of the mathematics curriculum she was developing, since he had seemed interested, and he said he would be glad to look at it. He stood on his porch and watched her cross the creek and go into her cabin, and he stood there for a moment after the door had closed. He went inside and sat down in his chair and stared at the cold fireplace for a long time. He was in trouble. He recognized the feeling the way you recognize an old scar, not with shock, but with the low certainty of something that has been there before and whose return you cannot pretend not to identify. He did not want to be in trouble. He had constructed his life specifically to avoid this kind of trouble. He had built the fence lines and he had built the internal ones and he had kept them in equally good repair, and the arrangement had worked for 3 years. Fannie Graves had not crashed through them dramatically. She had simply arrived on the other side of the creek and continued being herself, competently and without apology, and somehow that had been sufficient. He was not pleased about this, but he was not surprised either. He thought about Clara. He thought about her in the specific way he had learned to think about her, not the way he had thought about her in the first year, when the memories had been too raw and close, and had come with a physical component that he could only describe as a tearing. He had loved Clara deeply and completely, and her death at 23, and the death of their son who had lived 3 days, had done something to him that he had responded to by sealing over, the way a wound seals when there is nothing left to do but survive it. He had not sealed over anything dishonestly. Clara was gone, and the grief was real and permanent. But he was 30 years old and sitting in an empty cabin in Wyoming, and there was a woman across the creek who made him want to be less alone, and the wanting was both terrifying and, somewhere very deep and honest, something close to a relief. He did not act on any of this for 3 more weeks. The thing that finally moved him was almost comically practical. He had gone out on a morning in early October to find Fannie Graves's bay mare had somehow gotten across the creek in the night and was contentedly eating from his hay supply in the barn. He put the mare in his paddock and went to knock on Fannie's door with the information. She came to the door in her coat, already dressed, already looking like she had been up for some time. When he told her about the mare, she looked immediately relieved. "She has been nervous since the summer. I think the bear episode unsettled her. Your fence on the north corner needs attention. I noticed it yesterday, actually. The mare likely found the gap. I will fix it today. I can help. I am going that direction for my own fence check anyway." She looked at him with the particular look she sometimes gave him, which was the look of a person who is deciding something. "All right," she said. They worked the north fence line together in the brisk October morning, and the work made conversation easier the way shared physical effort always did. He talked more than he usually did. He noticed he was doing it and did not stop himself. At noon, she had packed a meal, and they ate sitting on the tailgate of her small wagon, bread and hard cheese and apples from the tree behind her cabin, and the mountains were doing something extraordinary with the October light that turned the whole valley gold and blue. "Why did you really come here?" he asked. "To Wyoming, not just the school board argument." She chewed a piece of bread and looked at the mountains for a moment. "My father passed the winter before last. He was the last of my family. My mother went when I was 12 and I had two brothers, but they are both gone, one to illness and one to the war. She said these things simply, without performing the grief or hiding it. After my father died, I realized I was very thoroughly alone in Laramie, and the town had known me my whole life, and that actually made it harder to figure out who I was without all of them. Does that make sense? It makes complete sense. So I thought if I went somewhere new, where nobody had a version of me already decided, I could figure out what I actually wanted. She looked at him. And what I wanted was a school, a real one. My own. That is a good reason to go somewhere new. What about you? Why Wyoming? Needed land that I could afford, wanted space. He paused. Clara was from this part of the territory. Her family is buried near Clearwater Bend. It mattered to me that she was somewhere familiar to her even after. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms between people who have given each other something real and are allowing it to settle. "You are a good man," she said, as matter-of-factly as she said everything, and it hit him somewhere behind the sternum like a physical thing. "I am an adequate man," he said. "I try to do right by what I am responsible for." "That is more than adequate. That is a great deal, actually." She handed him another apple. "Most men of my acquaintance define their responsibilities considerably more narrowly than you do." He took the apple. Their fingers brushed in the handoff, and neither of them made anything of it, but he was aware of it for the rest of the afternoon. He walked back to his side of the creek as the sun was going down, and the cold was coming back in with serious intent, and he stopped at the water's edge and made a decision that felt both reckless and completely inevitable. He would not act on it yet, but he had stopped arguing against it. The first hard frost came in mid-October, and with it, the first real test of whether Fannie Graves had understood what she was agreeing to when she bought 20 acres in Wyoming. She had. She had laid in firewood through September, more than he had expected for a first year, and she had banked her garden, and she had sealed the drafty spots in the cabin walls with a clay mixture that Walt Pruitt had taught her to make. She was prepared, but the frost also brought trouble of a different kind. 3 of John's cattle had drifted south in the confusion of a brief storm and ended up on the fence line adjacent to Amos Kellner's property. Kellner was a rancher 2 miles south who ran more head than his land could properly support, and who had been in a slow-burning dispute with John over water rights on the creek for a year and a half. The dispute had been managed through the land office and was legally resolved in John's favor, but Kellner's feelings about it had not resolved along with the legal standing. Kellner sent 2 of his men to bring John's cattle back with a message attached, delivered verbally by a young cowhand named Dix who looked uncomfortable with the assignment. Kellner wanted to discuss the creek diversion again. He believed the land office decision had been in error. He would like John to come meet with him. John went to meet with Kellner, because the alternative was a dispute that could become destructive, and he was a practical man who preferred to resolve things directly when possible. He rode down on a gray Thursday morning, and the meeting was tense and unproductive, with Kellner maintaining a fixed position that was factually incorrect, and John declining to pretend otherwise. They parted on terms that were not actively hostile but were not warm, and John rode back with the understanding that Kellner was likely to remain a problem. He told Fannie about it that evening, not because he was in the habit of sharing his troubles, but because it involved the creek and therefore potentially her property too. She was at his door when he arrived back, actually, which surprised him. She had a pot of something with her. "I saw you ride south this morning and you had the look of a man going somewhere unpleasant," she said. "I made extra." He was too tired and frustrated to perform the customary deflection. "Come in," he said. She came in. She set the pot on the stove and he told her about Kellner while she served the stew, which was venison this time, rich and dark, and she listened with the full attention she gave to everything. "Has no legal standing," she said when he finished. "No, but legal standing and what a man is actually willing to do are 2 different things. Does he have the capacity to be genuinely dangerous? He is not that kind of man. He is the kind of man who would try to make things difficult through persistent harassment rather than direct confrontation. Letting cattle onto neighboring property, diverting water unofficially, that sort of thing. Could he interfere with my school? John looked at her. He had not thought about that angle. How? He sits on the church deacon board. Walt mentioned it. If I am using the church hall for classes and he puts pressure on the pastor about it, I could lose my space. She said this calmly, as someone who has already lived with this type of problem before. That is a fair concern. I need to secure a proper building before winter gets serious anyway. I have been in correspondence with the county about a school land grant. If I can get the grant confirmed, I can start on a building in spring. She looked at him. Would you have time to put your name to a letter of support as a landowner in the district? Yes, he said immediately, without question. She looked at him in a way that was softer than her usual directness briefly, before she straightened it back into composure. Thank you, John. It was the first time she had called him by his first name. He knew she knew it, and he knew she had done it deliberately, and neither of them said anything about it, but something between them shifted gently and settled into a new position. They ate the venison stew and talked about the school grant and about Kellner, and about the state of the pasture grass, and the weather coming and the mountains, and the particular way the aspens had gone gold that year on the north slope. And by the time she rose to leave, the fire had burned low and the evening had gone entirely away. He walked her to the door and stood in the doorway as she crossed the porch, and she turned at the bottom of the steps and looked up at him. I am glad I bought that property, she said. And I am glad you live across the creek. He looked at her in the cold night, the stars enormous over the mountains, the creek a small sound in the darkness. I am glad you are there, he said, and it came out very simply and very honestly, and she held his gaze for a moment and smiled, just briefly, and then crossed the creek and went home. He stood in his doorway for a long time after she was inside with her light burning. November came, and with it Walt Pruitt's quarterly supply run, which was something of an event in the Clearwater Bend area, because Walt always brought news and mail, and occasionally items people had ordered months earlier and given up on. He stopped at John's gate first and delivered fence wire and salt blocks and a letter from John's brother in Missouri, and then crossed the creek to Fannie's. John watched from across the creek without meaning to. Walt spent longer at Fannie's than at his, which was not surprising given that Walt was fond of conversation and Fannie was better at it than John was. When Walt finally drove on down the road, John saw Fannie come out of her cabin and stand on her porch reading a letter, and even from across the creek he could see something in her posture that was different. He crossed the creek. He had not thought about whether to do it. He was just going. She looked up when she heard him on the bank, and she had the letter in both hands, and she was holding herself very carefully the way people do when they are keeping something from spilling. What is it? He said. The county has denied the school land grant, she said. Her voice was steady but only just. They say the district does not meet the population requirement for a dedicated school plot, which is technically accurate because Clearwater Bend only has 43 children of school age, and the requirement is 50. She looked down at the letter again. They say they will reconsider if the population increases or if a private citizen endows the land. He looked at her face and then at the letter and then at the mountains, and made a decision with the same speed and completeness that he made most of his important decisions. I have 4 acres on the northeast corner of my property, he said. Flat land, good drainage, easy road access. I'm not using it for anything. I will deed it to the school district. She stared at him. This was the first time he had seen her genuinely startled. John, that is 4 acres of Wyoming land. I know what it is. That is not a small thing to give away. I am not giving it away. I am putting it to use. He met her gaze. The land is sitting there. You need a place for a school. That is a reasonable allocation of a resource. You cannot simply, she stopped. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before, not the directness, not the composure, something warmer and more complicated than either. Why would you do this? He thought about answering practically, which was his instinct. He thought about explaining the resource logic again. Instead, he said simply and accurately, "Because I want you to have your school." The silence between them was of a different quality now. It had weight and warmth to it, the kind of silence that is not empty but full. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I will not let you simply give it. I will buy it from you at fair market value when I have the means." "Fine," he said, because he had known she would say something like that and it did not change anything. "I am serious." "I know you are. I have never doubted that you are serious about anything." Something moved across her face and then she nodded once, the way she did when something was decided. "Thank you, John," she said, and it meant considerably more than the two words it was made of. That evening, he sat on his porch as the cold closed in around the valley, and he let himself think about Fannie Graves honestly and directly, without the management he had been applying to the subject. He thought about the way she worked, the way she talked, the way she made room for hard things without flinching and moved through them without making a performance of the difficulty. He thought about what she had told him about being alone in a town where everyone had a version of her already decided, and how that had struck him with the force of complete recognition. He thought about her laugh, about the direct, warm brown of her eyes, about the way she had said his name for the first time at his kitchen table. He thought about Clara and about what 3 years of keeping himself sealed had cost him, and about whether Clara, who had been generous and alive in every way, would have recognized what he had done to himself and approved of it. He was fairly certain she would not have. Clara had believed entirely in living. He was going to say something to Fannie Graves. He was going to find the words. He had no particular talent for words, but he was going to find them. He just needed to do it correctly, which meant he needed to be sure she wanted him to say anything at all, and the indicators suggested she did. But he was a careful man with careful habits, and he wanted to be sure. The opportunity arrived, as opportunities often do, in an entirely unexpected form. It was a Saturday in late November, the first real snow of the season, and John came out of his barn to find a horse and rider picking their way along the creek road. The rider was a man about 40, city-dressed, which stood out like a fire in the snow, wearing a coat that was good for an office and not much else. He stopped at John's gate. "I am looking for Fannie Graves," the man said. His name, as it turned out, was Frederick Hensley, and he was a lawyer from Cheyenne who had come with paperwork related to her father's estate, some question about a small parcel of land in Laramie that had taken 2 years to clear probate. John told him how to cross the creek and went back to his barn and told himself it was none of his business who came to call on Fannie Graves. He was in the barn for about an hour before he came back out. From his position, he could see Hensley's horse still tied at Fannie's post. He went inside and made coffee. An hour after that, he was at the window when Hensley came out of the cabin, and he was followed to the door by Fannie. And Hensley said something that made Fannie's posture go very upright in the particular way it did when she was declining something firmly, and Hensley said something else, and Fannie shook her head, and Hensley mounted his horse and rode back down the road the way he had come. John was outside before he had consciously decided to go outside. He crossed the creek. She was still on her porch, watching the receding form of Hensley's horse, and she turned when she heard John, and her expression was somewhere between amusement and annoyance. "He wanted to buy the Laramie parcel from me," she said. "I said no. He then additionally proposed marriage, which I found presumptuous given that I met him approximately 90 minutes ago." She looked at John with bright eyes. "He is the second man to do that this year, incidentally. The first was the deacon in Laramie who agreed with the school board." "What did you tell him?" John said, and he was talking about Hensley, but he was also clearly asking something larger. "I told him that I had come to Wyoming specifically to make my own arrangements, and that I was very content with the arrangements I had made." She held his gaze. "That is true, by the way. What arrangements have you made?" His voice was quiet and very direct. She tilted her head slightly. "I have my land. I have my school building planned. I have my garden and my horses and my students. And I have," she paused, and the pause was deliberate, a neighbor across the creek who is one of the most decent and honest people I have ever known, and who I would like to know better than a neighbor if he is willing to discuss the possibility. The snow was coming down softly around them. The mountains were white and enormous beyond the valley. "I am more than willing," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. She took one step down from the porch and was standing on the same level as him, and he was close enough to see the brightness in her eyes and the snow catching in her dark hair, and she was looking at him with all of her characteristic directness and none of the guard that usually accompanied it. "You have been very careful," she said. "I understand why. I have been too careful, perhaps, but I think you needed the time." She looked at him steadily. "I am not in a hurry, John. I am not going anywhere." "I know," he said. "That is one of the things I like best about you." She smiled then, the full warm smile that he had seen only a handful of times and which was somehow more affecting for its rarity. He reached out and took her hand, which was cold from the November air, and held it in both of his. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if that suits you." "It suits me," she said. "It suits me very well." They stood in the snow for a moment, and it was the simplest and most complete moment he had experienced in a very long time. December in Wyoming was not a gentle season. The snow came serious and deep, and the temperature dropped to places that required constant attention and effort. John's cattle needed careful management. The water sources needed breaking each morning. The firewood supply needed monitoring. These were not new problems. He had managed them for 3 winters alone, but managing them with the knowledge that Fannie Graves was 20 feet across the creek, and that he was now permitted to simply go across and see her, changed the texture of the season entirely. He called on her 3 evenings a week, which was a frequency they had arrived at without explicit discussion, simply by the natural gravity of the situation. He would cross the creek after his evening chores and knock on her door, and she would let him in, and they would sit by her fire and talk, or she would read aloud to him from whatever she was currently using for school lessons, or he would help her with whatever project she was working on, of which there was always one. She was building desks for the school. She had the lumber and the design and a competent but limited set of woodworking skills, and he had better skills, and between them they were very productive. He would do the joinery and she would do the finishing work, sanding and treating the wood, and they would work side by side in her small cabin with the fire going and the snow outside, and talk the whole time. He learned things about her. He learned that she had a gift for mathematics that she considered unremarkable but which he found quietly extraordinary, the way she could look at a problem and see its structure in a single moment. He learned that she had wanted to be a teacher since she was 9 years old, when a traveling schoolteacher had spent 2 weeks at her family's property, and she had followed the woman like a shadow and asked her questions that the teacher had told her were better than most of her adult students. He learned that she had a fear of very deep water, not creeks and rivers, but the idea of an ocean, the scale of it, which she described as a reasonable response to something unreasonable. He learned that she had a talent for argument that she applied only to things she found genuinely important, not out of habit. She learned things about him. He watched her learn them, the careful way she took in information about him, stored it, used it. She learned that he was better at direct honesty than at emotional expression, and respected both facts equally. She learned that he had a facility with animals that went beyond training, a genuine communication, and she found this remarkable and said so. She learned that he had taught himself to read late, at 13, which was a fact he had not told anyone in Wyoming, and she received it with a straightforward respect that made him understand why children trusted her with their difficulties. He held her hand when he arrived and when he left, and one evening in mid-December he sat beside her on the small settee she had brought from Laramie rather than across the room from her, and the shift in proximity was like a change in atmosphere. They were reading through her mathematics curriculum that evening, or rather she was explaining her reasoning for the sequence of lessons and he was asking questions, and they were sitting close enough that her shoulder was against his arm and neither of them had moved away, And at some point, she had stopped talking about the mathematics, and he had stopped asking about it, and they were simply sitting there in the firelight. He looked at her. She looked at him. The moment held itself. He said, "Fannie," and that was sufficient. She turned toward him and he kissed her softly, and her hand came up to the front of his coat, not pulling him closer, just resting there present. And the kiss was simple and honest and very warm, and when it ended she was looking at him with an expression that was entirely new, open and warm and certain. "I have been wondering when you were going to do that," she said. "I wanted to be sure." "Were you?" "Yes," he said, "completely." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed like that by the fire for a long time without needing to say anything about what it meant. Christmas in Clearwater Bend was a modest affair, a church service and a small gathering at Walt Pruitt's store where the community exchanged gifts of practical value, smoked meat and preserved food and tools and fabric. John gave Fannie a set of surveying instruments, a good compass and a set of measurement chains, because she had mentioned wanting to properly survey her 20 acres before spring, and he happened to have a spare set from his own early work. She gave him a book. It was a natural history of Wyoming, published in 1876 by a professor from the East who had spent 2 years in the territory, and it had detailed engravings of plants and animals and geological formations. He opened it there at Walt's gathering and looked at the first engraving and then looked at her. "You remembered that I was interested in the survey of the property," he said, "when I told you about learning to survey." "I remembered everything you told me," she said simply, and the straightforwardness of it settled around his heart like something warm and solid. New Year's arrived cold and clear, and John made a resolution that he did not write down or speak aloud, but which sat in him with quiet certainty. He was going to ask Fannie Graves to marry him. Not immediately, not until she had her school established and he had rebuilt his north barn wall and they had known each other through at least one full cycle of seasons. But he was going to ask, and he had no particular doubt about what she would say. January was hard. The cold was deep and consistent, and there were 2 storms that required both of them to spend days without being able to cross the creek because the water was running high and fast. During one of these periods, John stood at his bank and looked across to her cabin and saw her lantern burning, and found that it was enough, temporarily, just the evidence of her light in the dark. When the water went down after the first storm, she came across immediately and he had hot coffee ready because he had seen her coming from the window. She came in with snow on her coat and her cheeks red from cold and said, "I could hear your cattle last night. Were they all right?" "Lost a calf," he said. "The cold was too much, but the rest came through." "I am sorry about the calf." She sat at his table and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, and he sat across from her, and they looked at each other in the particular way they had developed, which was frank and warm, and entirely without the careful distance he had once maintained. "I did not like being unable to see you," he said. "Those 4 days." "Neither did I," she said. "I kept finding reasons to go to the window." He looked at her. "After Clara died, I told myself I would not care about anything like that again. The caring was the part that could be taken away. I thought if I did not let it exist, there was nothing to lose." She was very still. She understood what this cost him to say. "And now," she said quietly, "now I think I was wrong. I think the not caring cost more than the risk of the caring." He looked at the table and then at her. "You came across a creek in the dark to knock on my door about a bear, and I have not been the same since." She looked at him with those brown eyes that never flinched and said, "Good. I intend to keep waking you up for bears." He laughed. He did not laugh easily or often, and when he did it surprised him every time, and she looked delighted by it in the specific way she had, which was warmly and without making a fuss. February was when Amos Kellner made his move, and it was not the kind of move John had anticipated. Rather than any direct property dispute, Kellner had gone to the pastor of the Clearwater Bend Church and raised a pointed objection to Fannie's school, suggesting that a woman teaching without a proper school structure was irregular and that the church hall arrangement was inappropriate. The pastor, who was a reasonable man named Whitfield, did not entirely agree with Kellner, but was sufficiently pressured to tell Fannie that he could not continue the arrangement past the end of February. Fannie came to tell John about this with her composure fully intact, but her jaw set in the way it got when she had encountered active injustice. "He has done this because of your water rights dispute," she said. "He is using my school to put pressure on you." "I know," John said. He was already thinking about it. "How many desks do you have built?" 14 plus 2 smaller ones for the younger children. "My north barn has an interior room I used to use for equipment storage. It is 30 feet by 20 feet. Concrete floor, solid walls, good ventilation from the loft above. I am not using it this time of year and will not need it before April." He looked at her. "It could be a school." She stared at him. "In your barn. In a room in my barn. It is as solid as any building in this county and considerably warmer than the church hall, which I have always found drafty." She was quiet for a moment, doing the geometry of it in her head, which he had learned to recognize. "It is actually larger than the church hall," she said. "I know, I measured both." She looked at him with a brightness that went straight through him. "When did you measure the church hall?" "Last week, when I thought this was the direction things were heading." "John Abbott," she said, and there was something in her voice that he had not heard before. "You are a remarkable man." "I am a practical man," he said, feeling the warmth in his face that he knew she could see and that he could not do anything about. "There is a difference." "There is not," she said. "Not in you." The school moved to John's barn room in the first week of March, by which time the ground was beginning to soften and the mountains were doing things with the light that made the whole valley look like something imagined. The 14 children who came on the first day looked around the large clean space with its whitewashed walls and its rows of wooden desks, with an astonishment that Fannie reported to John that evening, with a kind of pride that was entirely unself-conscious. "Eli Crane touched the wall like he was making sure it was real," she said, "and then he sat down at the largest desk and opened his reader and started going before I had even called for attention." John smiled. He had been hearing about Eli Crane for months and felt that he knew the boy already. "When is the school building going to break ground?" he asked. "April, if the land office confirms the property deed by then. I have 3 families who have pledged labor and Walt Prout has agreed to supply materials at cost." She looked at him. "I want to ask you something and I want you to say no if the answer is no, because I know you have your own work." "Ask. Will you oversee the building?" "The construction. I know timber frame and I know the plan, but managing the build and the labor is something I would do more slowly than you would." "Yes," he said. "I will oversee it." She looked at him for a long moment and then reached across the space between them and took his hand and held it, and did not say anything else, because she did not need to. Spring came in March and April, and then fully in May with the wildflowers coming up in the meadows, and the creek running high and bright with snowmelt, and the aspens putting out new leaves that made the whole north slope shimmer. The school building went up over 3 weekends with 8 men working and Fannie directing the interior work with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything. John worked alongside the other men and watched her move through the construction site, checking measurements, asking sharp questions, redirecting things that were going sideways with a combination of authority and good humor that won every man there to her side completely. He watched the men respond to her, and felt a complicated warmth that was both admiration and something more specific and particular. One evening during the building, he was taking inventory of the lumber supply and she came and sat on the stack of boards beside him and they watched the sunset over the mountains together. "It is going to be a good building," she said. "It is going to be a very good building. Because of the land. Because of the land and the design and the people building it," he said. "But primarily because the person it is for knew what she needed and went and got it." She looked sideways at him. "I had help." "You built the conditions for the help. That is different from needing it." She was quiet, looking at the mountains. Then she said, "My father always said that knowing when to accept help was as important as knowing how to give it. I think he was right." What was he like? She smiled at the mountains. Stubborn, principled, bad at apologies but very good at showing up. She looked at John. You would have liked each other. He thought about this. I think so too. He would have liked you specifically. He had no patience for posturing or dishonesty. You are the most unposturing person I have ever met. That is because posturing takes energy I prefer to spend elsewhere. She laughed, and it was the full, warm laugh, and he turned and looked at her in the evening light, her dark hair loose because the pins had come out during the day's work, her face bright from the sun and the exertion, and he thought, with complete and settled clarity, I am going to ask her. Not yet, not tonight, but soon. The school building was completed on a Saturday in late May with a small dedication that Walt Prout organized, which involved most of the Clearwater Bend community assembling to look at the new structure, eat food that people had brought from their homes, and listen to Fannie give a short speech that was precise and warm and made several people in the audience visibly emotional. She talked about education as the thing that makes a future different from a past. She talked about Clearwater Bend's children deserving the full breadth of what could be taught and what they could learn, without limitation based on who their families were, or what anyone had decided for them before they had the chance to decide for themselves. She looked out at her students as she said it, including Eli Crane, who was now 13 and had become her most advanced student. And John stood in the back of the gathering and watched her speak, and felt what he felt with complete allowance for the first time. That evening, after everyone had gone home and the new school sat quiet in the early summer night, John and Fannie walked back to the creek together in the long June light. The wildflowers were up on both banks, blue and yellow and white, and the creek was running clear and cold, and the mountains were purple and enormous. He stopped at the bank. Fannie, he said. She stopped and turned to face him. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want you to know that I have thought about it carefully, and I am certain about what I want, and I am asking because I mean it, not because of circumstance or habit or any reason other than that I want to spend my time with you. She was watching him with those steady brown eyes, and he could see that she knew what was coming and that she was entirely present for it. I love you, he said. It came out without stiffness, without the effort he had expected. It was simply true and simple to say. I know I have not been easy to know. I know I was closed up for a long time and you found me that way and came across the creek anyway, and I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life. I want to marry you. I want to build something with you that is bigger than what either of us could build alone. I want to be your husband, if you will have me. The creek ran beside them. The evening light was gold and long across the grass. John Abbott, she said, and her voice had something in it that was full and warm and completely sure. I have wanted you to ask me that since approximately October. He reached out and took her face in both hands, and she was already reaching for him, and when he kissed her it was nothing like the first careful kiss by the fire. This was full and certain and lasting, and when they separated she was holding his coat in both fists and her eyes were bright. Yes, she said. Absolutely, entirely yes. He held her in the long evening light beside the creek that had run between their lives all winter and spring, and felt something in him that had been sealed for 3 years open entirely, not with the tearing it had sealed with, but smoothly, as a door opens that has been built well and set properly on its hinges. They were married in August of 1879, 1 year and 2 months after Fannie Graves had arrived on Walt Prout's wagon with her trunks and her cast iron skillet. The ceremony was held outdoors near the creek, because neither of them was particularly inclined toward the indoors for large occasions, and because the August morning was clear, and the mountains were doing that thing with the light, and the sky was the specific blue that Wyoming kept for important days. Walt Prout stood with John. Fannie had asked Margaret Whitfield, the pastor's wife, who had been quietly encouraging toward Fannie's school from the beginning and had become a genuine friend, to stand with her. Eli Crane, who was now the best reader in 3 counties according to Fannie, read a passage from one of her school books, a section about the value of knowing where you are in order to know where you are going. John stood in his good coat, which he had brushed clean and pressed himself, and watched Fannie come across the creek on the stepping stones they had placed for the occasion, her dark hair pinned up with flowers in it that she had picked that morning from the meadow, wearing a dress the color of cream that she had made herself over the previous month in evenings by the lamp, and he thought clearly, "There is nothing I will ever see more beautiful than this." She reached him and took his hands and looked at him with the full directness she had always offered him, and they said the words to each other in front of everyone they knew in Clearwater Bend. And when the pastor declared them married, she squeezed his hands hard and he squeezed back, and the community around them made the particular sound of collective happiness that groups of people make when something good has happened in front of them. That evening, after the gathering had gone and the creek was quiet, they sat on the porch of his cabin, which was now their cabin, and the late August stars were coming out one by one over the mountains, and she was leaning against him with her head on his shoulder, and he had his arm around her in a remarkable absence of anything that needed to be done. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The north pasture," he said. She laughed. "Seriously?" "I am thinking," he said, "that it has been a long time since I sat on this porch and felt like the right amount of things were present." She tilted her head up to look at him. "That might be the most romantic thing you have said." "I have a limited range." "You have a very specific and effective range," she said. "I would not change a word of it." He kissed the top of her head and she settled back against him, and the stars continued their appearance, and the creek ran on in the dark, and the mountains held their ground, enormous and permanent, the way Wyoming held everything it valued. The school opened that fall with 21 students, and Fannie announced to the county school committee, who had eventually come around when the population count made their original denial look small-minded, that she intended to have a second room added by 1881 to accommodate the growing enrollment. John had already begun planning the addition in his head. Amos Kellner, for his part, had lost 2 of his 3 ranch hands by November to better opportunities north, and had come to John in late October with a considerably modified posture about the water rights, which he had finally accepted as settled. John had been civil and direct, and had let it rest where it was, because holding grudges cost the same energy as posturing, and he preferred to spend it elsewhere. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the first winter in 3 years that John Abbott lit his cabin fire against the cold, with someone else's warmth already in the room. He found that the quality of the cold was different when you were not alone in it, not less cold but somehow less total, as though the temperature was simply weather now rather than an additional comment on the state of things. Fannie taught her school through November and December with a dedication that impressed even John, who had high standards for dedication. She had added a second day of classes in the evenings for the adults in the district who wanted to improve their reading and arithmetic, a development that surprised him slightly. "Walt Prout asked me," she said when he asked about it. "He can read, but he wants to be a better reader, and there are 4 or 5 others." It seemed like a poor reason to say no, simply because it was extra work. "That is the most thing you have ever said," he said. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said, "not remotely." She had him help her design a series of arithmetic problems to use in the adult class, and he did so with the particular enjoyment he had discovered in working with her on anything intellectual, the way her mind moved, the way she built a problem up from its foundation and worked it outward. In March of 1880, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning over breakfast, sitting across from him at the kitchen table that he had built the previous fall, larger than the old one to accommodate 2 people properly. She told him plainly and directly as she did everything, and watched his face while she did it. He set down his coffee cup. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you well?" he said. His voice was very careful. "I am entirely well," she said. "I feel well, and I have spoken to Margaret Whitfield, who has had 4 children, and she says the first few months are the worst of it for most women, and that after that it is different work." He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, and she put her hand out across the table and he took it. "I know what you are thinking about," she said quietly. I know what the fear is." He looked at her hand in his. "She was strong and healthy," he said, meaning Clara, keeping his voice level. "And it still went wrong. I know medicine is better now, I know that, but I know what the fear is." "I know," Fannie said. "And I want you to feel the fear and also believe me when I tell you that I am going to be careful and that Margaret knows what she is doing and that we are going to be fine." She squeezed his hand. "Can you do both of those things?" "Yes," he said after a moment. "I can do both of those things." He came around the table and pulled her to him and held her for a long time, his hand at the back of her head, and she held him back and neither of them said anything, and it was the right kind of quiet. The pregnancy proceeded well. Fannie, being Fannie, continued teaching until the end of May, at which point she put her most advanced student, a 15-year-old girl named Clara Oates, who had been with her from the beginning and had a talent for explanation, in charge of the summer lessons, and began managing her time from the cabin with a collection of books she had ordered from Cheyenne. John found things to build. He had always found things to build when his hands needed occupation, and he built a cradle that was arguably over-engineered for a cradle, with smooth-fitted joints and polished wood and rockers that moved with a precise arc that Fannie said was going to lull the child to sleep better than anything else in the territory. He accepted this compliment by continuing to sand the finish to a higher standard. November of 1880, with the first snows on the ground and the mountains white to their shoulders, they had a son. He was born on a cold, clear morning with Margaret Whitfield in attendance and Walt Prout standing unnecessarily in the yard, because Walt could not sit still when he was anxious, and had appointed himself self-sufficient company for John, who was likewise unable to do nothing, and so was chopping wood he did not need in the temperature he was not feeling. When Margaret came to the door and told him, he went inside and sat beside Fannie on the bed, and she put their son in his arms and he held the child, who was small and absolute and entirely present, and he sat very still for a long moment. He had been afraid of this. He had been afraid of exactly this particular magnitude of loving something, because the magnitude matched the potential cost, and he had learned at great expense what the cost could be. He sat with the small weight of his son and looked at Fannie, who was watching him with tired, bright eyes, and understood that the sealing he had done to himself after Clara was something he had already undone so slowly and so naturally over the previous 2 years that it had not felt like undoing. It had just felt like living. And this particular moment with this particular weight in his arms and this woman watching him from the pillow, was what living completely actually was. "Thomas," Fannie said. "I would like to name him Thomas, for my father." "Thomas Abbott," John said, and his voice was something he did not try to manage. "That is a good name." She reached out and he took her hand and held it, and the baby in his arms made the small sound of someone deciding the world is acceptable and settled into sleep. Walt Prout knocked on the door approximately 40 seconds later to ask if everyone was well, and Fannie said yes with enough warmth that Walt, who was easily moved at the best of times, had to blow his nose loudly on the other side of the door before he came in to see the baby. Thomas Abbott grew in the manner of ranch children, outdoors and curious, and with a thorough education provided by his mother before he was old enough to attend her school officially. He learned to read before he could walk without falling, or so Fannie claimed, because she had been reading aloud to him since before he was born, and the habit had simply continued. John taught him the land. He taught him the fence lines and the cattle work and the creek crossings, and the names of the mountains and the behavior of weather. Thomas absorbed all of it with an intensity that reminded John, when he allowed himself to see it, of himself at the same age, before the years had taught him to apply that intensity selectively and guard the soft parts. He did not guard the soft parts with Thomas. He did not guard them with Fannie. He found that having stopped guarding them did not make him weaker. It made him more specifically himself, more capable of doing the things that required full presence rather than managed distance. Clara Oates, Fannie's prize student, completed her schooling at 16 with an academic record that Fannie called the best she had ever seen, and at 17 took over the younger children's classes when the school's enrollment made a second teacher necessary. Fannie supervised and taught the older students and the evening adult classes, and the school grew to 30 students by 1882 and required, as she had predicted, the second room addition. John built it over the summer of 1882 with Thomas underfoot at every stage, asking questions that were so specific and relentless that the two hired men who helped with the framing took to calling the boy Professor, which Thomas accepted with the gravity of someone who considers this an accurate assessment. Eli Crane, by now 17, had been writing letters to a teacher training college in Denver for 2 months. He came to Fannie for help with the application, which she gave with the particular combination of high standards and absolute belief in him that had defined her teaching from the beginning. He was accepted by the fall of 1882 and left for Denver with a set of books Fannie had assembled for him, each one marked in the margins with her notes, and a letter she had written to his prospective supervisors that John had read over her shoulder, and which was so unflinchingly and specifically enthusiastic that it had made him quietly glad he was on the right side of her opinion of him. Eli hugged Fannie on the day he left, which was not something men did with teachers in 1882 in Wyoming territory, and which was therefore an entirely Eli thing to do, and she hugged him back without any hesitation and told him he was going to do important work. He was crying somewhat, and he climbed onto his horse and rode toward the Denver road, and Fannie stood watching until the dust settled and then turned to John with full eyes and said, "Well, he is going to be fine," John said. "I know," she said. "I'm just going to miss him specifically." She took a breath. "He is the reason I keep teaching. He is why it matters." "He is one reason," John said. "There are 30 others." She looked at him. "You are very good at knowing what to say. I told you I had a limited range. The range has just gotten somewhat more specific over time." She laughed and took his hand, and they walked back across the field toward the cabin, and Thomas came running from the direction of the barn to meet them, shouting something about one of the horses, and the ordinary beautiful life of the thing they had built together moved forward in the afternoon light. In the spring of 1883, Thomas turned 3 and began attending his mother's school for mornings, which he had been demanding since the previous fall on the grounds that he already knew what she was teaching and wanted to help teach it, which Fannie had explained was not quite how schools worked. The compromise they arrived at was that he would attend as a student in the mornings and, on select afternoons, be permitted to show the younger children how to do things he already knew how to do, which was actually an effective teaching method, and also provided him with sufficient importance to make the rest of schooling acceptable. Fannie told John in June of 1883 that Thomas was going to have a sibling. She told him the same way she had told him about Thomas at the kitchen table in the morning, with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes watching his face, and this time the fear he felt was smaller than the first time and was met more quickly by the thing that was larger than the fear. When, he said, "January, I think," he reached across and took her hand. "You are well." "I am completely well." "Good," he said. He held her hand. "Thomas is going to be unbearable about this in the most wonderful possible way," she laughed. "He will try to teach the baby mathematics before it can hold its head up. He gets that from somewhere." "He gets it from his mother," she said. "You are patient with the mathematics. I am enthusiastic. The enthusiasm is what makes the mathematics work." She looked at him with that warmth that she had stopped half hiding somewhere in the second year, the warm, direct certainty of it that had become the reliable constant of his days. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said back simply, and it was true in the same way that Wyoming was large and the mountains were permanent, factually and completely. Their daughter arrived in January of 1884 in the same cold, clear manner as her brother, and was named Ruth for John's mother, who had died when he was 12, and whose direct and capable character he had never stopped attributing his own directness and capability to. Fannie had suggested the name herself, having heard John speak of his mother 3 times in 5 years, which was enough to understand what she had meant to him. Ruth Abbott was from her first weeks a different sort of person than Thomas, quieter and more observing, with John's way of taking in information before responding to it. Thomas declared her acceptable within 48 hours and thereafter became her self-appointed protector and educator, in a combination that was sometimes overzealous and always sincere. The school added its 3rd room in 1885. Clara Oates married the young man who ran the telegraph office in Clearwater Bend and continued teaching, which caused a modest scandal among the people who thought married women should not teach. A scandal that Fannie addressed directly and publicly at the next county school committee, meeting with an argument so well constructed and calmly delivered that it ended the conversation permanently. Amos Kellner sold his ranch in 1884 and moved to Denver, and the property was purchased by a family named Greaves who ran a smaller and better managed operation, and who became good neighbors, the kind who waved across fence lines and helped each other in hard weather without keeping a ledger. Walt Prout handed over his supply route to his nephew in 1885, but continued to stop in at the Clearwater Bend area regularly because, as he told John, he had friends there and some things were worth the ride. He arrived on his visits with candy for Thomas and Ruth and news from the wider territory, and he sat at John and Fannie's table with the comfortable ease of someone who has been present at a life long enough to have earned the chair. John stood in the north pasture one evening in the summer of 1885, after the day's work was done, and before the evening was properly started, in the long gold light that the Wyoming summer made in the hour before sunset. He could see the school building from here, its solid lines against the mountains, and he could see the smoke from his cabin chimney where Fannie was making supper, and he could hear Thomas somewhere to the south, shouting at something with the full-throated conviction of a 5-year-old who has encountered something remarkable, and he could see Ruth in her mother's arms on the porch, small and dark-haired and watching the world with those steady eyes. He thought about the man who had driven iron staples into fence posts for 3 years, with the mechanical fury of someone who has sealed himself against everything gentle. He thought about what that man had wanted, which was to survive what he had survived without being taken apart by it again, and he understood, standing in the evening light of this particular life, that he had both honored that need and moved past it at the right time and in the right company. He had not forgotten Clara. He did not expect to forget her, and he did not want to. She was part of the land and part of him, and her grave was tended, and her name was remembered, and the love he had had for her was real and permanent in the way that real things are permanent, held without diminishing everything that came after it. What came after it was this: the school and the ranch and the creek between them, the 2 children who were the specific and unrepeatable people they were, and Fannie Graves Abbott, who had driven up on Walt Prout's wagon with a cast iron skillet and a direct gaze, and had crossed his bank and stood in his creek and looked at him without flinching until he had, eventually, had the sense to look back. He walked back to the cabin across the evening pasture, and she looked up from the porch when she heard him coming, Ruth in the crook of her arm, and she smiled at him, the full warm smile that still hid him somewhere behind the sternum every single time, and he came up the steps and kissed her and took his daughter from her arms and stood there with them both in the last of the light. "Thomas is somewhere in the south field shouting at a ground squirrel," he said. "He has been having a significant disagreement with it since mid-afternoon," Fannie said. "I expect the ground squirrel is winning. He comes by the stubbornness from somewhere." "From both sides equally," she said without any doubt whatsoever. Ruth made a small sound and turned her face against his shoulder, and John Abbott stood on his porch in the Wyoming evening with his daughter in his arms and his wife beside him, and the mountains holding the sky up the way they always had, solid and enormous and reliable, and the creek running clear below them in the darkening light, and felt, with the complete and grounded certainty of a man who has come through something and arrived somewhere real. That every hard year and every sealed corner and every morning of solitary fence work had been the path to exactly this, and that this was, without any qualification at all, exactly enough. Thomas came running up from the south field 30 seconds later with his boots muddy, and a story about the ground squirrel that required several interruptions and a great deal of arm movement to tell properly. And Fannie sat on the porch rail and listened with the full attention she gave to everyone who needed it. And John sat down in the porch chair with Ruth and listened too. And the evening came on soft and full of stars over the Clearwater Bend Valley, and the creek ran on below them in the dark. And everything that mattered was present and accounted for, and would be there in the morning.